Hey everyone, I just wanted to maybe share something has kind of been on my mind and something that popped up as I was talking with Pastor Doug and Pastor Frank over at my church after a committee meeting that we just got done having. Now, I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression. Nothing dramatic happened at the business meeting. Everything was very calm and peaceful and all that. So this isn't a conversation sitting here re-adjudicating something in behind closed doors of a committee meeting. But it is kind of relevant to, I guess, maybe a perspective that I feel like a lot of people are kind of quick to lose sight of when it comes to their relationship to their church and their pastor. And I know that when I kind of open up talking about that, that's something where it's probably pretty easy for, honestly, the people that I wish I could just sit down and talk to about this kind of stuff. Honestly, I could just see a lot of them kind of tuning out. But I want to at least put it out there so that maybe for anybody who does kind of come across this and sit here and say, okay, well, that's something I hadn't thought about. Maybe it gives a little bit of a different perspective. One of the things that I think a lot of people kind of lose sight of is the fact that I think the statistics are that it's either 3, 4, or 5 years is the average basically lifespan of a pastor sitting at an individual church. And a lot of times it's not because pastors have gotten like somehow more like corrupt or more evil or something like that. I'm certain that there are a lot of different causes for that. A lot of times we like to sit here and zero it down just like a very simple reason. Pastors do this or they do that or they don't listen to these people. And in reality, people and situations are complex, and sometimes they're more complex than just one particular issue. But when they do that, they tend to focus in on, a lot of times the pastor, the senior pastor or other associate pastors that are helping out. And when this happens, you can start looking at the pastor as maybe kind of a thing, or maybe like a service provider, somebody who works at a fast food place, and we say, I'll take the number 2, the extra large, Sunday service only, and don't talk to me any other time of the week, value meal. And we kind of treat them that way. And then if we don't get exactly what we want, we get mad and we want the guy behind the register fired. Well, when I got done, with this committee meeting, I was talking a little bit with Pastor Doug, who's the guy that got ordained with me, and we were talking a little bit just about some of the various little frictions that pop up. They're naturally going to pop up in any church family, and kind of the different perspectives that people have when it comes to how they think the church should be run. And then doing this, there were certain facets of the conversation, not really related to the specifics of what he was saying, that were really sticking with me and were kind of bugging me. And later on, as I started looking at my Facebook feed, I actually saw an article that was posted by an individual named David Christie, who is the pastor that actually married my wife and I. And it was from the Baptist News, and it's titled, "Too Many Pastors Are Falling on Their Swords." Now, what it does is I got kind of intrigued looking at it, but then as I started reading it, I guess, there was kind of like a little bit of a different message came out of it than maybe what I thought it was about. What it did was it basically outlined a lot of the perspectives that a lot of the pastors have that are very easy to overlook if you just kind of look at the pastor as that service provider. And it gave some basically 5 tips for pastors, but it also gave 5 tips for congregants. And when I was reading these were things that I was looking at and saying, I wish that I could maybe open up the aperture a little bit for a lot of people to be able to see, how pastors interpret some of these different conflicts that pop up, whether it be about something that's church governance or whether it's how a committee is run or anything else. So I just want to share with you, I guess, what the 5 things were for the congregation, but maybe not dwell on this because you could read the article yourself, but maybe kind of give you just a little bit of at least my perspective on it. The first thing was it says, first accept the fact that your church is not, in caps, the church. And so what I mean by that is that we know that the church is basically the physical embodiment of Christ here on this earth. We are the representatives of Christ. But that being said, any one particular church itself is not the representative of Christ. So in other words, I guess what that means is the way that this church or that church is governed or set up or organized, that's not some sort of affront to the person of who Christ is. And a lot of times we have this tendency to get so wrapped up in either our church versus another church, or how we think the church should be run versus how somebody else thinks the church should be run, that we start losing sight of the fact that our church, little t, little c, the church, exists to really be a part of the church with a capital T and a capital C. And when we lose sight of that fact, the church stops serving its actual role. It stops doing what it's really intended to do. So I mean, that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind when we start getting, very wrapped up and emotional about things, about how administrivia, about how the church is set up. The second thing is kind of similar. It says, second, accept that your pastor is a shepherd and not, again, capital T, capital S, the shepherd. Pastors can make mistakes. They can make mistakes maybe just as much or if not more than some of you. I can tell you right now, so I am an ordained pastor. With that being said, I am not going to claim to be any better or less sinful than the next person. I mean, pretty much guarantee that. But when I sit here and I think about that, I mean, that you kind of look at it and say, but as soon as somebody knows that you're a pastor or somebody sees you that way, all of a sudden it's almost like their eyes are kind of put on you a little bit different and they're looking at you differently. It's something where when they would normally look at somebody and say, well, you know what? Yeah, that's a flaw they have, but whatever. They're just a person. They have their flaws. As soon as it's the pastor, it's somehow like unacceptable, and a lot of times you end up getting people who say, well, this person has a personality flaw. And while normally you would say, well, that's just kind of another person, either in my church or my community, and they need to kind of deal with it, they end up looking at it and saying, no, that's my pastor. I want him fired because he has a flaw. It's almost like they wouldn't be happy unless they had like Jesus Christ himself as their pastor. But in reality, pastors are flawed. They make mistakes. And because they make mistakes, the same way you need grace, the same way I need grace, our senior pastors need grace too when they make those mistakes. And they need the love and compassion to kind of help them get over whatever those mistakes are when they do make them. But that's something to kind of keep in mind, again, that we, our church is not the church, and our pastor is a shepherd, but he's not the shepherd. So we should respect him as a shepherd. But at the same time, not expect the kind of perfection out of him the way we would out of Christ. The third thing is to just pray for your pastor. I would say the amount of times I hear complaints about a pastor versus the amount of times I've heard people say they pray for the pastor are very disproportionate. Now, that's not a good indicator because clearly I don't have some magical crystal ball where I can see into the prayer lives of every single person. Sometimes my own prayer life isn't exactly what I would want it to be. But that being said, pastors need prayer. Their job is oftentimes very, very thankless. I know that we have like Pastor Appreciation Month, and that's awesome. But, being a pastor can be very difficult. The number of times that I've had a conversation with whether it's our senior pastor or whether it's another colleague that's in youth ministry or something like that, who's just getting beat down by just like the constant barrage of everything around them, and not just people. I mean, but just like right now, I mean, COVID, everything getting shut down, whether that's, situations with parents, whether it's honestly dealing with things that they have to deal with. I think sometimes when people come up and they, at best, maybe say things that are kind of insensitive to the fact that somebody has had like a full day and we're mad about, the fact that we don't think this committee's being run right or something. And at worst, times when people will really actively seek to cut down a pastor, which does happen, let's not kid ourselves. I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that pastor sometimes has had to deal with, people coming to them and unloading all of their problems on that person. And it can be really hard. I can tell you that the first time that I had a situation with somebody randomly walking into the door with the church saying they want to talk with somebody, I got together with them. We went to the church office. We sat here and had a conversation, and they just started pouring out their heart about how horrible everything had been for them and how they had, contemplated suicide and all kinds of other things. And at the time, I guess I was a little bit newer in some of this, so it was definitely one of these moments where I had to I think the actual phrase I used to our senior pastor was, so that kind of messed me up a little bit, just because I wasn't ready for it. But the thing is that, pastors, again, they have their own things that they struggle with, but they got to be strong when they are sitting here and working with other people and trying to be that love and be that compassion and be that strength for those individuals. And again, it's very easy to sit here and get wrapped up in just what we're focused on in the church and forget that that pastor does all of those other things. And just because they're not putting every single time they do something like that in the newsletter or putting something like that on social media, it doesn't mean that they're not doing that stuff every single day, both in person, online, on the phone, reaching out to other individuals. And it's very emotionally draining. I mean, I could just tell you in my limited amount of stuff, doing things with more often than not youth, I mean, it can really weigh on your heart. The fourth thing is it's an interesting challenge. It says, for the next 6 months, commit to staying and being the best church member you can be. Now, this is interesting because so often I hear some variation of the phrase, I'm unhappy about X, and because of that, I'm doing Y. So it's a very transactional way of looking at being a part of the church. I'm unhappy, so I'm going to hold back my ties. Or I'm unhappy, so I'm just not going to show up for a while. Or I'm unhappy, so I'm not going to be willing to, whatever, serve on X, Y, or Z, team or whatever it is at the church. And again, that's something where it can be very tempting to do that. It would actually make sense in a way to do that if it were any other organization. But it starts like inadvertently punishing people that really are not at fault. Is the pastor really at fault if they have characteristic flaw? And the same way with you or me, they weren't, nobody was willing to come up to them in kind of like love and calm and not being judgmental, say, this is how I feel. Let's come up with resolution. If nobody's willing to do that, then can you really fault that pastor? I mean, could I fault you or could you fault me if nobody gave us that courtesy and had issues with us? So, I mean, it's something where again, it can be very tempting to sit here and kind of take the spiteful approach, but I do think that there's something to it, whether you do it for 6 months or not. That's what the author of this article talks about. I do think there's something to be said for looking at it and saying, instead of me looking at things in a very transactional sense, is there some way that I can basically go above and beyond and try to be overtly positive or encouraging or something to my pastor just for a while? Think of it this way. Even if I think, well, this pastor's already shown how they're going to act and how they think. Even if I think that, you know what, let me give them the benefit of the doubt and sit there and act, be super supportive and everything. And you know what, if it still seems like there's no resolution at the end of it, then maybe there is a deeper problem. But give that a shot at least, rather than kind of like eliminating the person from, I guess your own grace without, give them a shot at the very least. And hopefully through the end of it, hopefully, even if that pastor doesn't somehow do things that you really, really like, maybe there'll be a little bit of a change of heart. I mean, maybe we'll be able to look at our pastors in a way where we say, you know what, I'm a flawed individual, and despite that, Christ still chose me. And I should be willing to show that same kind of grace to my pastor. It's food for thought. The last thing I think is really important. It's fifth, advocate for your pastor's mental health. So mental health is obviously something that I know a lot of people take very, very seriously. It's something that, we like to think of our pastors as being just rock solid and stalwart and not changing. I know I've made comments myself about different preachers and kind of said, I like that individual as like an individual. Like I could see myself hanging out with them and smoking a cigar, but I don't know if I don't want that guy to be my pastor because he just didn't seem like he has that like rock solid, basis. But the thing is pastors, kind of like I was saying with that individual who came into the church talking to me, they deal with a lot. In this article, the author was saying that they were on a Zoom call with 10 other pastors. And there was one pastor in particular who apparently spoke up and basically just said that, he wasn't saying I am suicidal, but he was saying I've thought about it. It's been a thought I've had. So, they call it suicidal ideation. People who kind of have these thoughts, not really to the point of talking about like doing it or committing to it or anything like that, but just like you've had the thought. And as they went on and on, out of these 10 pastors, 4 of them, that's 40% of them had said, yeah, I've had the same thought. And what this individual is pointing out is that these individuals were not brand new pastors who just weren't seasoned and weren't hardened. These were people who had been in the industry, so to speak, for a while. They had been shepherding churches, and yet they had these struggles. It's something that is easy to overlook and it's easy to trivialize. It's easy to, I guess, kind of dismiss it and say, well, if they've had those thoughts, then maybe they're just not strong enough for it. But it's very easy to put all of those burdens on your shoulders and then to just get drugged down into a very dark and deep place. I can say that because I've had the same kind of thoughts. Now, again, I stress, I'm not trying to sit here and say I'm like, I've struggled with suicide or anything like that. I'm not saying that at all, but I've had those kind of thoughts. And I know I've sent a message to my senior pastor about it. And I sent I sent the same message to my wife about it because I actually, didn't even want to talk to her. I didn't want it to be a stigma or anything. But it is a very real thing. Pastors need support. Maybe there was a day and age, there certainly was, where the pastor was an individual who wore these gorgeous robes and everybody just did what the pastor said. But today, the pastor is oftentimes treated so much as just kind of like a figurehead, like a monarch in, the UK or something like that. If we're going to sit here and live as Christians, and we truly believe all the things in the pretty little leather-bound book that we talk about that we believe, we have to be willing to look at our pastors in the way that the Bible has laid it out. We have to be willing to acknowledge that there is something that is, I'll go ahead and say it, a little supernatural, not about the pastor himself, but about the calling. That a pastor has been given a calling to serve and to love people. That can be just crushing to that individual's soul when the very individuals that they are called to reach out to and to love and to try to guide in ministry are the same individuals that, are either, as one individual in this article, kind of noted, coming in and yelling at them about what they preached about, blaming them because of, their policies of how they're doing COVID, or maybe are even dealing with really tough decisions and with really tough situations like, how do I counsel this individual who themselves are not just having suicidal ideation, but actual suicidal thoughts? I don't know if any of that meant anything to anybody. I don't know if anybody takes anything away from it. But my hope is that more individuals, especially kind of in the modern evangelical church, would be willing to, I guess, just offer pastors a little bit of grace. Understand that we're individuals just trying to follow the good book like you are, but we also have this charge of trying to minister to you. And we live in an age where individuals are very individually empowered and are very independent. And, from a societal perspective, not going to push back at that at all. If we sat here and got all political, I would probably sit here and just wholeheartedly agree with a lot of things about the individuality of individual people. But understand that as a part of the body of Christ, we are not called to a life of individuality. We are called to a life of unity. As the Bible says, as recently preached about, with one baptism and one faith, one God. This is what we are called to as individuals. And this is my prayer for the church, is that the church overall would be able to appeal to a sense of love and forgiveness and fight that urge to be very tribal and to cling on to the things that they want to see. It would be easy to sit here and say people are just being selfish, that people are just being closed-minded, but I don't think that. I think that most people, possibly all people I can think of, that I agree with, disagree with, what have you, are the hero of the movie in their mind. Nobody's the villain inside the picture that's inside their head. Everybody wants something that is in some way, shape, or form good as they see it. All we're trying to do as pastors is to take that desire to pursue what is good and to illuminate and to enlighten and disciple individuals to say, look at this thing God has that's good. You want to pursue good. I want to pursue good too. So let's figure out how we can do this together. And we're going to disagree. We're probably going to have heated disagreements. But let's do it together and let's do it in love and understanding rather than having the same kind of visceral tone we see all the world around us. So anyway, this has already gone on longer than I wanted it to. But again, I hope that maybe this has offered a little bit of insights into how pastors end up having to deal with things. And maybe next time you see your pastor, tell him you appreciate him. So anyway, thanks.